Good afternoon and welcome on behalf of ForSpace. Thank you for joining us today on Zoom and Facebook for the 6th and final episode in the Sustainability Across Disciplines Lunchtime series of presentations. We're so happy you could join us here today. As Zoom attendees, we encourage you to ask questions throughout in the Q&A feature, and our moderator, Dr. Rebecca Titler, will address them after the presentations. You can also raise your hand during the question period and be allowed to speak if that's what you prefer. For those of you following along on our Facebook page, please do go ahead and comment below this video. We'll be sure to relay your questions and comments here into Zoom as well. It is now my pleasure to invite Amy Poteet to introduce today's session. Over to you, Amy.
Thank you, Anna. I'm Amy Poteet. I'm one of the two co-directors of the Loyola Sustainability Research Center, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you on behalf of both the Research Center and the Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability to this series, which we're really pleased to be able to do in partnership with ForSpace. This series is a product of what was intended to be a conference on sustainability across disciplines that had been scheduled for 16 through 18 March and had to be canceled because the university closed and we had all sorts of disruptions related to the pandemic. So it's a real pleasure to be able to have some of the presentations available to you in this format. Thank you for joining us. I'll now hand things over. Our presentation today is by Sharla Patterson, who will be introduced by her supervisor, Dr. Jochen Jaeger, who is also the former co-director with me of the Sustainability Research Center. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all here and to introduce Sharla Patterson. She is a master's student in our department, in the Department of Geography, Planning and Environment, and she's in the program of Masters in Environmental Assessment, which is a very interesting program and pretty much unique across Canada. It focuses on environmental impact assessment. She has done a master's before, I think in biology at McGill, and then she wanted to apply all her knowledge, and environmental assessment is a very good place to apply such knowledge. So she has then worked on her internship report in our lab. I was able to support her work on her thesis. It's basically a master's thesis, and she will put this all together for a publication in a peer-reviewed journal. So without further ado, I would like to pass on the word to Sharla Patterson, just mentioning that her talk is about ecological connectivity. So this is all about the movement of wildlife in the landscapes. And they, of course, encounter all kinds of barriers, but Sharla will explain.
Perfect. Let me just get my screen up here. All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Jaeger, for this introduction. I'm very, very excited to be with you guys here today to share my research with you. Like Dr. Jaeger said, I was originally doing my master's in biology, and I transitioned into EIA because I feel this is a really important policy tool that can be used to improve the way that we go about pursuing resource exploitation in Canada. This project in particular is looking at the inclusion of ecological connectivity in Canadian environmental impact assessment. So more specifically, this project seeks to understand to what extent ecological connectivity has been considered in the EIA process in Canada in the absence of explicit policy. I wanted to identify performance gaps and ultimately provide recommendations to inform future EIA policy. So when I'm talking about ecological connectivity, like Dr. Jaeger was saying, this is pertaining to the degree to which the landscape facilitates or impedes movement. Traditionally, this was talking about species, but it also extends to gene flow, populations, as well as interactions between different parts of the ecosystem. So this is like an important thing to keep in mind when I'm talking about this. I mean, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. So when I talk about performance gaps, I was looking specifically at a few different criteria specifically. So I wanted to see whether or not the inclusion of ecological connectivity in the EIA process in Canada varied based on some different parameters. So specifically, I looked at different environmental legislation, because we transitioned from SIA 1992 to SIA 2012. So those are the ones that I've looked at in this project. I wanted to see if there was a difference based on the different development sectors. Based on proponent types, so whether or not projects that were pursued by crown corporations had a difference in the inclusion of connectivity compared to those that were pursued by the private sector. I wanted to see if there was a difference between projects that included ecological connectivity as a valued component in the process, so meaning it was looked at exclusively or between sections of the environmental impact statement itself. From this point on, I'll probably be using a lot of, two acronyms specifically, EIA, which stands for Environmental Impact Assessment, and EIS, which is the Environmental Impact Statement. This is the report that's produced whenever an assessment is done for a project. So to give you a bit of a schematic overview of the process that I followed for my project, the first thing I needed to do was establish a basis of comparison to evaluate the environmental impact statements. So I went into the landscape ecology literature and I made a table of this to summarize the different tools and techniques used to evaluate and measure ecological connectivity. I then created a series of review questions. And then I selected 14 projects from the Canadian Impact Assessment Registry to be assessed. For each of those documents, I read them, collected data, and I assigned scores based on the review questions that I'd created. For each of those scores, I applied a weight, and I obtained a final score for each of the EISs so that I could make comparisons between them. So these were the review questions that I developed. So the first thing I would like to mention is that there are 19 questions in total, and they span the different sections of the EIA process. So for those that might be less familiar, the process involves initially scoping, and then you do a baseline characterization. Once you have a baseline, you can identify and evaluate key impacts of the project. You can look at alternatives, and then you do mitigation, monitoring, and follow-up. And then finally, you do a cumulative effects assessment. So this is a map to show the different projects that I included. Each point indicates a project. The first thing I'd like to make note of is the icons that are in pink were projects that were assessed under the 1992 legislation, and those that are in green were assessed under the 2012 legislation. The little icon indicates the sector that they're from. You'll see right away that there are a lot of mining projects, and then the rest of them kind of span a bunch of different sectors. Off to the right, there is a table that gives you the sample sizes for the different parameters that I was looking at. And I really tried to choose projects that span the entire country, and I tried to also include projects from different sectors. On a more granular level, the process that I followed for my project involved accessing all of the documents pertaining to the project that were relevant to the assessment. So I read, rather than doing a keyword search, I read all the relevant sections, because sometimes the language when referencing something like connectivity can change or be quite variable. So a lot of times they might be talking about fragmentation, which is also a reference to connectivity. They'll talk about habitat loss. They'll talk about, sometimes they do talk about connectivity or biodiversity. So I thought that the best way to pursue this would be to read the sections that were pertinent, including the appendices for these projects. Now, these are really large documents, so this is a pretty rigorous process. Some of these assessments are up to 1,000 pages long just for the report. So then the appendices on top of that. I didn't read the entire document. I read those sections that were relevant to where connectivity was most likely to be referenced. And then I used the evaluation questions that I mentioned, I showed you previously, to ultimately assess whether or not connectivity was included. For each of those 19 questions, there was also a series of sub-questions. The reason I used sub-questions was to create a certain kind of structure to this process, because when you have projects that span a lot of different sectors and you hold a mining project next to a hydroelectric project, it can be quite interesting to see how they'll consider different factors in that process. So I wanted to make sure there's a certain kind of structure to my evaluation, and that consistency was quite important. I didn't use a series of yes and no questions because I did want to capture a certain amount of nuance between the projects. So when I read each of the projects, for each of the sub-questions, I tried to address it in a commentary on the side and before I started to apply a score. So when I did apply a score, it ranged from 0 to 5, where a score of 0 meant that that criteria was not considered at all. And a score of 5 indicates that it was well considered, it was even excellent. I then used this formula, which is a weighted mean to assess, to apply a final score for each of the projects. So the weight in this formula is based on, I assigned weights to basically have questions that pertain directly to connectivity contribute more to the final score, which can vary between 0 and 1. So as the score approaches 1, it indicates that a higher number of the evaluation criteria were satisfied and that ecological connectivity was better assessed in that project. So here are some results. So the first thing that I would like you to notice about this graph, there's the names of the projects on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis you have the ecological connectivity assessment index, which is the score for how well ecological connectivity was included in the project. The colors of the bars indicate the sectors that the project is from. There's also a vertical line that breaks this graph into two. So those that are to the left were assessed under the 1992 legislation, and those to the right were assessed under the 2012 legislation. And then the final, the best possible score that any project could get was a score of 1. However, there was only 3 projects that broke the 0.5 mark, and the highest score that any project received was 0.6. The two of the best performing projects in this process were actually hydroelectric projects, and then the other one was a mining project. So if we go into a little bit more detail, so when I was talking about those tools that are used to assess and evaluate ecological connectivity, this is a table of those tools that I summarized. So at the top, you have the names of the projects again with the symbols to indicate the sector. And for each of those tools, there's an X next to those that the project actually applied. So there's a total possible score of 15 if they did all of them. And the highest score that was achieved was 6 for one of the hydroelectric projects. I think the most interesting thing to take away from this was that one of 4 projects actually included ecological connectivity as a valued component. This is not a requirement in our environmental assessment process as of now, or even in the past, those under each of the 2012 or 1992 acts. But even with that, some of the projects still did include it. There was also a project that, although ecological connectivity was not included as a valued component, it was still heavily referenced throughout their entire EIS document. They also did a very thorough alternatives assessment that looked at increasing hydrological connectivity in aquatic ecosystems within the project space. So that was a really, really interesting thing to see. And finally, all of the projects did field surveys and inventories. However, this is a requirement in the EIA process. And I wanted to just make note that even though all of the projects did field inventories, it doesn't mean that they were all done with the same level of quality or effort. So some of these projects did field surveys over multiple seasons. They used historical data sets. They did radio collaring. They had like a pretty thorough process, whereas others, they were done much more quickly and with a lot less effort. So I think that's an important distinction to make. So getting into some of the nitty-gritty results here. Ultimately, I found that under the different acts, there was no significant difference in the consideration of ecological connectivity. I also didn't find any statistically significant difference between development sectors. So I did group all of the other projects together to ultimately make a comparison between mining projects and all other projects. This was I didn't have enough data points for each of the individual development sectors to be able to make a more fine scale comparison. However, even with that, there is no statistically significant difference between them for those projects that I looked at. The same thing with proponent types. Crown corporations that were pursuing projects did not necessarily include ecological connectivity in a way that was significantly different from the private sector. So this result is statistically significant and is quite intuitive. So those projects that included ecological connectivity as a valued component in general had a higher score for the consideration of connectivity in the overall project itself. And lastly, when looking at the different sections of the EIS document itself, there was a statistically significant difference between the scoping phase and all other phases, whereas there was no difference between the all other phases once you compared them between each other. So this is an interesting result, and it makes sense. In general, the projects did better in the scoping phase because it's a pretty, it's a fairly qualitative and well-defined process. So this involved the description of temporal and spatial boundaries for both the study and the project. So it's fairly concrete, and the guidelines are quite clear about what's required for that section. It starts to get a little bit more complicated in the EIA process once you get into things that are a little bit more vague in the guidelines, and also like for key impacts as well as cumulative effects assessment. So this is not a surprising result. So I think that it points to a necessity for better guidelines and instructions for EIA practitioners as well as for the proponents for development projects, which leads me into my conclusions and recommendations. So I think the takeaway message from this project is that ecological connectivity is largely absent within the EIA process in Canada and the EISs themselves. So if we want ecological connectivity to be something that is considered in the EIA process, it needs to be integrated into the policy. So if, for instance, if ecological connectivity became a necessary valued component, it would be integrated into all of the projects. It also points to the necessity for better guidelines for the assessment of ecological connectivity. As I mentioned before, there were multiple projects that included connectivity as a valued component. But even still, for those projects, the level of analysis that they applied was still not particularly rigorous. They did a lot of assessment based on not descriptive statistics, like landscape metrics. So these are pretty, let's say they're quite superficial ways to evaluate connectivity. So I think if we want to see a more profound analysis, we need to provide better guidance so that they have an idea of what to do, when it's necessary, and then what to do with the outcome. So better research to tie into mitigation measures and recommendations. And then finally, it points to a necessity for building capacity amongst EIA practitioners. So better training sessions and access to workshops and things like this so that they can actually do these types of studies. The other thing that I'd like to make note of is that there's a lot of variation in the effort invested in characterizing and assessing impacts on biological components, including ecological connectivity. So like I was saying before, even though all of the projects were doing field inventories, they're not all done with the same level of effort. This points to a necessity for minimum standards as well as guidance on what they need to do in that process. So I think that this is a really important component to increase the overall standard of biological data collection so that we actually produce assessments that are better all around. So from the very beginning at baseline characterization all the way through to mitigation measures, I think having a solid basis for data collection is pretty essential. So the last thing that I think that is important to take away from this is that even those projects that did find that there would be residual impacts, they basically discount them entirely based on the application of mitigation measures, follow-up programs. However, there really seems to be little to no oversight as to whether or not these measures are being applied or if they're even adequate. So this is a huge issue because if you find that there's going to be no adverse environmental impacts based on mitigation measures, but they're not actually being applied, or they're not actually good enough to serve their purpose, then it kind of defeats the purpose of the entire assessment to some degree. degree. So this points to a need for better enforcement of implementation of mitigation measures. Probably more research required to see if mitigation measures are even adequate for mitigating the effects that they are supposed to, as well as better commitment to follow up and monitoring as part of the project approval. So I'd like to thank you all for being here today and for attending my presentation. I'd be very happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Sharla, for this great presentation. Really a lot to learn in there. Do we give the audience a chance to type if you want, or you can raise your hand and ask a question live. If you have a question you'd like to type, I will read it out. You can enter it into the Q&A section. By preference, if you enter it into the chat, I will also read it out. I'll start though while our audience is typing with a call for the panel. Are there any questions from the panel apart from me? Okay, if there aren't any, then I'll start it off since I have the mic anyways. So if I'm not mistaken, there is a new Impact Assessment Act, am I right?
Yeah.
As of last year. So I know that you haven't had a chance to actually analyze any data because it was just last year. But do you have an impression as to whether connectivity has been addressed in any more solid way through the new regulations, or whether it's going to be?
That is a really good question. I wish I had better news to report on with regards to that. They made a solid effort to reference biodiversity a lot without actually providing any concrete guidelines on how to do that. So it's a lot of, this is gonna maybe be kind of controversial, it's a lot of fluff without any real teeth. So especially the process that they had for trying to develop the new legislation was really beautiful. They went around the country asking experts, like, what would you want in your dream environmental process? And then the document that came out of that really doesn't do a very good job of including connectivity at all. Yeah, unfortunately, it's quite, I don't think it's going to be revolutionary with respect to my research anyway.
I haven't followed the process too closely in the past few months, but do you know if there's hope that regulations will be developed that might help based on the legislation?
I'm not sure I understand, like if they'll change the guidelines again?
Well, often an actual act, so an actual law, is the basis for then the development of regulations, which provide more specific details on detailed guidelines. Is that the case for this Impact Assessment Act, or not?
I don't think that the guidelines are going to. So basically, when the Harper government came into power and they overhauled SIA 1992, they basically they changed the entire approach that we take in terms of, like, for instance, now there's a project list instead. So it's like they drastically reduced the number of projects that will trigger an assessment, and they also changed the timeline so that they're a lot shorter. Unfortunately, for a lot of these projects to have a really rigorous process, it takes time. So having really tight timelines is a kind of a way to also, it's going to compete with the quality of the assessment, I think, is maybe one way to say it. I don't think that this is going to improve, because under the new legislation, they didn't really change those things. Those were pretty important things that they should have addressed, and they didn't. They kept the short timelines. They kept the project list. They also, they did restore the Fisheries Act, which is cool, but because it was kind of gutted under Harper, so that's good. But overall, I don't think it's going to. I wouldn't hold my breath on that one. I don't think it's getting any better than that.
It's disappointing. Thank you, Sharla. I have Jochen has his hand up. Jochen, did you want to add something?
Yes, I was wondering, Sharla, would you think it's just a little too early, like considering that the IUCN just published their big report and guidelines on connectivity, I think a week ago or so. Do you think that might give us some hope that things will improve in Canada based on this report, and also based on the connectivity working group that Environment Canada has just initiated like half a year ago?
That would be incredible. Honestly, I think that I hope so. I really hope so. I don't know if that's going to have I mean, historically, how often is the perspective of experts been used in like the development of like, do you think it's actually going to result in concrete like guidelines? Because I think I'm skeptical. I'm hopeful, but I'm also skeptical. I mean, the document that they produced for the consideration of connectivity is pretty great. It's impressive, and I think it has a lot of value. It could contribute just to develop better environmental laws. I don't know whether or not this government is going to use that. Maybe if we had, I'm skeptical. I just because they already had a lot of really important information in their hands when they first started to overhaul CETA 2012, and they didn't really use it. I'm not sure that adding more expertise to the pile is really going to influence their approach, because I think they're kind of already invested in keeping the status quo in the interest of, you know, making of keeping the economy afloat because we're heavily dependent on resource exploitation in Canada. So I don't know if they're going to really do anything that might jeopardize that or appear controversial. So I don't know. I'm not super convinced that that's going to happen anytime soon.
Amy, did you have something to add to that?
It's a different question. I think we still have time for another question. Yes. Yes. So, okay, I want to maybe get a more positive take. There is some variation in the cases, and you did have 3. It's not a huge number, but you did have 3 that did go over the 0.5 mark. I know this was not the goal to look at why you see different projects going more or less in the direction of paying attention to connectivity, but then you did read a lot. So I'm wondering if you have any sense of why those 3 did so much better than the others. I mean, even if they're not where we would like to see them ideally, it might give us some hints of where there's sources that could be played up to encourage improvements with others.
Yeah, I'm really happy you asked this question, because I feel like my previous answers are quite depressing, and there's actually a lot of hope that came out of this project. It's not all just bad news. So the first thing that I'd like to mention is that I think the size of the project is going to be an important aspect. So 2 of the projects that had the highest scores were hydroelectric development projects. And these, like, we're talking really, really huge study areas. So I think that it does necessitate a little bit more effort, but they were also pursued by the government, and they were also a lot in cooperation with some of the Indigenous groups that were living in that area. So there's a lot of advocacy happening on those projects. The other thing, and I don't know if that's statistically significant, I didn't assess that. I didn't have enough data to actually like see whether or not that was part of it. But the other thing that is worth mentioning, there's that mining project. It was the Sison project, and in their evaluation, like I said, they didn't include ecological connectivity as a value component, but it was not just referenced often. It was this essentially the basis of their alternatives assessment. So they ended up removing an old dam that was blocking passage for fish in the area. It was fantastic. A lot of alternatives are looking at like different locations, or if you should put the road a little bit to the left. They really did try to do something that would have positive impact for the environment as a whole in that region. So I really felt that they just had a whole different perspective in the process itself. They had their entire project read and validated by a biologist. So that's really something that is entirely unnecessary in our process, but they did it anyway. I don't know if it's because of the management in that company, or I don't know if it's if they had just some very, I don't know how you say, practitioners that were sensitive to these issues that had those skill sets. I think it might be a combination of things, but I think it points to if more projects start doing it this way, it does elevate the standard. It provides a basis for an example of how to do it that way. Because I don't think that everyone's just neglecting this because they hate connectivity. I think it's an absence of guidelines, examples, and tools that are not necessarily as accessible. So I truly believe that if we want to go in that direction, it starts with capacity building and also making sure that that companies, proponents, and the government understands why this is necessary, why it's important. Especially, we don't really have time to go too much into this, but if we're looking, I think strategic environmental assessment is going to be one of the ways that connectivity can be better integrated into this project, because it captures things at a larger scale, at multiple scales, but also at a larger scale. So I think that there's a lot of potential to go in the right way, especially now that strategic environmental assessment is becoming a pretty hot topic. So it's not all bad news. I think it's going to take some time, and we're still kind of percolating on this, but I think we're going to go in the right direction eventually. Let's hope it's sooner rather than later. But yeah.
Jochen, did you have one final point? We are running low on time, so I'll let you get the final point in.
I try to do it quickly. So I wanted to say, well, now we have a perfect hypothesis here set up, right? Which is, some people hope things will improve over the next years with the new legislation in place. So somebody should repeat your study exactly the same way in 10 years. And then we can find out. So if you can please publish all your work and explain exactly what you did. So if it's somebody else, maybe it's even you yourself who will do this again in 10 years. And these studies would be great. It's really great to then see all 3 periods of time there. And the question I was wondering about, do you think why it hasn't been considered better is an issue of scale? Like, we know that cumulative effects assessments is usually done very badly. And would connectivity be more in the cumulative effects assessment or the project scale assessment? What's your opinion there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that we're still trying to figure out where it fits in best. I think it has a lot of potential to improve cumulative effects assessment. Honestly, like, that is by far the section that was the most disappointing. It's clear that there are, in some of the projects, I don't think they actually know what cumulative effects are, which is already quite concerning. So I think that that's probably a really good place where you can fit this in, because yeah, it does touch on multiple scales, and it might help better, it might, I don't know how to say, mieux encadré, like it might provide a better context for this type of assessment, but I think it's still kind of, I personally think that would be a really good place to start integrating it, is in that aspect of project evaluation. So that's my perspective, but we'll see.
Okay, I think we need to end there because we're out of time, but thank you for a really informative presentation, Sharla. And thank you for the Force for hosting us, to Jochen Jäger for sending his students here, and for the great participation, to Amy Poteet and her co-director, Jim Grant, for the support of the Research Center and of the college. And thank you all for participating. This is the last of our series, so I know some of you have been here through the past 2 weeks. Thank you so much for taking this journey with us. Do stay tuned. We are planning our next Sustainability Across Disciplines conference, which will be open to the public for March of next year. It will be March 17th to 19th, 2021. We don't yet know whether, child's elbow. We don't yet know whether that will be online or in person or some combination of the two. But either way, do stay tuned, and we hope to see you then. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you. I feel like that beeper just told us we're running out of time, but please bear with us one more second. I have just a couple of closing remarks. I want to thank a very special thank you to Rebecca Titler, Jochen Jäger, Amy Poteet, Jim Grant, and of course all of the participating students, and you, the audience members who have joined us the last 2 weeks. Now that we have come to the end of this series, I'd like to thank you really for bringing this project to us. We've been so pleased to be able to be a part of it and to support the work of all the participating students. The caliber and variety of research really related to questions of sustainability is really inspiring and speaks to the important and insightful research happening at Concordia at the undergraduate and graduate levels. So thanks for that. A quick reminder that a recording of today's event and all 6 episodes of this series will be available on our website, which is concordia.ca/4. We'll be sending all of the panelists and all audience members over the 6 episodes a link to those videos to our archive, and we'll also send you to our Facebook page where you can watch them and share them at CU for Space. So on that note, I'm saying goodbye. Thanks again, everyone. And we look forward to hearing about how your research takes shape in the future. So stay tuned, keep in touch. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.